how do we take something like radical Dharma? We have folks who would like to kind of come out more proudly about who they are, specifically in the context of mental health, or claiming the label of neurodivergent, which itself is a radical act. So I guess I'm wondering, how can folks take some of that kind of inner knowing that you talk about and apply that to living proudly as a neurodivergent person?
The critical point for all of us is at some point to realize we've been hoodwinked and bamboozled, and simultaneously that is not something that turns inward on us and puts us on like an angry, like hate the world path, but rather is an invitation to, as I said, liberate ourselves from ideas and myths and madness that what is not ours, that we inherited a way of thinking about who we are, a way of thinking about what is possible for us, and a way of thinking about what normal is, and therefore, as a result, we then have anxiety, or we experience stress in expressing who we are, right? So when kids grow up, when they first start, like, they're not having any anxiety or stress about just expressing full on who they are, right? As you talked about in the story when you're a young girl, right? There's no anxiety. It is only the referencing off of external sources that starts to tell us a story of like, oh, you're not so normal, things ought to be like this is how you should be. And there is certainly some value in understanding how things are operating relatively, but what we don't ask ourselves often enough is, but what are those set of ideas and instructions for? And if I'm not intending to maintain those, or I'm not going to take it on to maintain those. So, for instance, keeping your room clean, it might be something that your parents want in order to maintain an orderly household, and you may decide, like, that's your business and I'm not taking that on. Or you may decide, I take it on for limited periods of time. But that's very different than taking it on that something's wrong with me, right? So then we're in greater choice and understanding the difference between the way that we are given information about how to relate that isn't about who we are, but it is about how to relate that works for the sake of relationships, right? And then we can work from there. I think the critical thing is really understanding that we have to get under the idea that is passed on to us and that is inherited by us and that is communicated us through the force of culture, that if we don't line up to some kind of expectation, that means there's something quote unquote wrong with us. What it means is that we're part of the human family and that we express and we have emerged differently, and whatever deity or divinity there is that exists chose it to be that way, and it's none of our business to get in the way of that. And in fact, we have a responsibility not only to ourselves for our own thriving, but also as our contribution to humanity to express that uniqueness out into the world, because the world is waiting for us.
And can you talk a little bit about how you've done that in your own life? And I know we've talked before, and I've read a little bit about your own childhood, and sensitivity is something that we've talked about a lot, and sort of that trait, and how you found yourself sensing a lot around you and taking on a lot. Could you maybe walk us through, what your experience was like, going from having that kind of childhood in your youth, and how you kind of, transformed or brought along with you all of these other frameworks and identities, and that has contributed to you and your work now, but curious to hear more about your life.
Yeah, so as a child, I was, and it's, it's very difficult to know the difference if it was the cause, or if I already existed somehow in a particular state of sensitivity, but I was abused as a child. And so what the term that I would get labeled with is I was hyper-vigilant as a result. And so, and it's funny, I was just having this conversation with my partner this morning, that I was hyper-vigilant as a child, and that meant I paid exquisite attention to every movement and inflection of especially adult beings around me. And, taken from this vantage point, I could say that was necessary for my survival. I literally had to know what other people were thinking and heading towards before they knew themselves, so that I could get out of the way, right? So I could politely or not impolitely make my exit. Was a salvation technique, right? So I don't know if I came with it or it was a result of that. I've actually been told I was sensitive before that.
It's oftentimes both, like just as a side note, because this comes up a lot in this question.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
People have this question of like, trauma is a big topic. It's definitely like a buzzword right now, and with good cause. But there actually hasn't been enough space in the dialogue for looking at both and. Because it is often an inborn characteristic, of being sensitive, and it's definitely sometimes can be the result of trauma, and oftentimes it's not, and so it's timely that it's come up.
I don't actually think that we get anything from outside. I think that it's sort of like things are switched on, and so or enhanced, because I know people that have had, not the same background, but they've also been abused as children, and they didn't end up hypervigilant in the way that I did. And so I think it is there is something about coming with things that were then enhanced. And what I did is rather at some point the sense that I was going to live the rest of my life viewing myself and being viewed by others as this thing happened to you, and so now you're somehow limited or flawed, or you won't ever live to your full potential, or you have these things that are getting in your way because you don't. I was rather introverted and rather shy, and whether it was a result of that is hard to tell, but that's the story that I was told.
Right.
So I got to a certain point, and I became very curious about how it is that I related, and actually how to make use of the way that I was relating to be beneficial for myself and for others. Because one of the things I could see that came with my hypervigilance was that I was quite sensitive to what other people were feeling, and when other kids were getting bullied, that I was the kid that would resonate with them and be willing to go and talk with them and be willing to sit with them or walk home with them or whatever the case may be. So when I got to be old enough, I actually started studying paths that gave me little hints of like, oh, I'll be able to figure out something about myself. One of the things I was sharing was I studied NLP. And NLP, actually, neuro-linguistic programming. It's often thought of in terms of like sales and marketing, but they nickname it the study of excellence. And the idea was that actually what they did is they studied people. It didn't emerge out of nowhere. They studied people that, particularly therapists actually, that had a high degree of success with resonating with young people that had difficult experiences in their lives, and they mapped it so that they could understand what is it they were doing. So in other words, what is it that people can do that other people can then learn to enhance their qualities of rapport with others, of listening, of being attentive. And so my hypervigilance then was no longer something that was keeping me from functioning well. It actually became something that enabled me to pay exquisite attention to the world around me, and to be willing, as a result of whatever experiences I've had, to actually be willing to call out and name the things that I was seeing, precisely because I was understood in many ways to not belong, it actually gave me permission, right? And so it was like, you're not like us and you're not like us. And it was like, great, I'm not like anybody. I get to say anything I want.
And you've
so I
talked about how
actually
you
used it.
you turn to books a lot, right? And sci-fi and sort of the world of comics. And so, is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Kind
I
of
still
like
have
straddling
I have a
different
Wolverine. Yeah,
identities
my sense of like a fixed personality is very loose, right? I mean, I clearly express a personality, but like this is my stage personality. I have my other ways of being. I'm really wild and zany. I'm really deeply introverted and quiet and pulled to myself. I'm very stoic in other situations. So I'm not committed to a particular performance of my personality, right? And I'm also quite clear that at any given moment, it's all some version of some kind of performance of this notion of me, right? And understanding, like it's all some version of a projection at any given moment gives me a lot of flexibility so that when someone then says something against this particular performance of my personality, I can just slip out of it and say, okay, like that's fine, let's try on something else. So I think fixedness is something that I got a pass out of as a result of being very, very sensitive. And it made me have a different kind of relationship to the notion of taking on other people's feelings. So that wasn't a bad thing, but I also learned how not to have it be a thing that overwhelmed me or defined me.
And so can you talk a little bit about how this informs your work now, and also, you know, what your hope would be for, you know, other sensitive folks out there or neurodivergent folks, sort of as they move through their lives and integrating all these different principles and aspects of identity?
One of my main things is pretty much always I had to learn to stop actually like noticing pretty much everything, right? So I notice all sorts of movements and just inflections in people's bodies, and so I had to train myself actually to be not less aware, right, but to actually focus my attention to really what was important in any particular moment. And so that actually gave me the skill of like more, you know, deeply embodied listening skills. So I taught myself this practice of when you were speaking, for instance, I could see like some slight movements, and so I shift my attention to actually tracking what you're saying by closely speaking your words in my own head. So that all I'm doing is actually feeling your words in my body. And what I would say to people that are hypersensitive, right, very sensitive, that are living lives, is that you have like really unique gifts. I now teach this, that was the point. I now teach this, and people feel like they get an experience of listening and being listened to in a way they never have been in their life. And it comes from basically taking how I relate to the world internally, this deep sense of like literally resonating with people's words, and I teach it. And so every single one of us, especially if you're sensitive, this world is waiting for you and like desperately needs what you have to offer, because we are living in a society that is dulling us out and would rather have us cut off from our feelings and our sensitivity so that we can fit like cogs into the wheel of productivity and capitalism. And it's an act of resistance to actually choose our sensitivity and to cultivate it in ways that don't let ourselves get, you know, completely overwhelmed, or to create spaces in which we can be completely overwhelmed and we can do that safely. So I think that what I would say to people is to recognize that actually you have a gift that is really, really necessary, and part of the reason that that gift is being squelched is because it is counter to what the society requires of us. And when we can't feel ourselves, we will allow an enormous amount of atrocity and inequality to go on unchecked. And so the fact of our sensitivity is actually something that the society, as it were, right, that is keeping us in kind of on track to just simply produce things. What it also keeps in place is our willingness to abide by atrocity, to abide by inequality, to abide by the decimation of peoples. And so if you want to be more sensitive to the world around you, go and connect with one of us sensitive people, because we'll show you how to do that.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for Rev Angel.